Take away the bound Bible, numbered pages, raised lectern, and neat rows of forward-facing seats from the room entirely. Replace them with a long scroll whose destination is hidden inside two tightening coils while everyone waits. Luke begins the decisive action with one ordinary movement. Jesus stands up to read before any explanation begins. An attendant places Isaiah in his hands, making the reading visibly communal rather than private under the gaze of neighbors. To reach a passage, he must manage the weight, tension, and exposed surface of parchment without letting it sag or scrape. There is no chapter 61 marker waiting at the top of a page, only continuous lines and spaces. Luke says he finds the place, a phrase that implies practiced navigation through columns, not a miraculous jump to a number. The prophetic words do not remain ink. They become a voice heard by neighbors in the same shared air. Then he rolls it, returns it, sits, and holds the room without another gesture as expectation gathers around him. This investigation reconstructs that physical sequence, the room around it, and why public hearing drives Luke's scene using text, manuscripts, and archaeology. Luke 4:16 places Jesus in Nazareth, the town where he had been brought up. He enters the synagogue on the Sabbath, described as his custom, after teaching elsewhere in Galilee. The hometown setting will matter later. The narrator gives a precise chain of actions: standing, receiving, opening, finding, reading, rolling, returning, and sitting. Those verbs are our strongest evidence for the event's physical choreography. No other gospel supplies this same detailed sequence. Luke does not describe a formal procession, a fixed reading cycle, a permanent platform, or a modern sermon service. Later Jewish customs can illuminate possibilities, but they cannot simply be projected backward. The difference between evidence and reconstruction begins here. Nor has archaeology handed us the exact Nazareth room. The text names a synagogue, but no securely identified building from this episode survives for us to photograph or measure. Any interior image must therefore remain comparative and modest. A first-century biblical scroll was not a single endless skin. Scribes joined prepared sheets, wrote ruled columns in ink, and rolled the finished manuscript so only a limited section remained exposed. The result behaved like a movable archive, not a codex. The great Isaiah scroll from Qumran offers a remarkable comparison. Copied around 125 BCE, it preserves Isaiah across 54 columns and stretches roughly 7.3 meters, more than 24 feet. Its survival lets modern viewers see scale rather than imagine it. That famous manuscript is not the scroll Jesus used, and it may not match Nazareth's copy in size, spelling, or material details. It simply reveals what an ancient Isaiah scroll could demand. Comparison is useful precisely when its limits remain explicit. Instead of facing one page, a reader faced vertical columns arranged across the opened span. The beginning and end of Isaiah remained rolled away, physically present but invisible. Reading required controlling both the visible and concealed portions. Ancient manuscripts could include spacing, paragraph marks, corrections, and other scribal cues. They did not carry the chapter and verse numbers that now make a reference instantly searchable. Our familiar reference system was added many centuries later. Finding the passage likely depended on familiarity with Isaiah's sequence, remembered wording, and visible landmarks in a particular copy. We cannot recover the exact method Jesus used that day. Expertise was partly bodily, learned through repeated handling. Picture the motion. Release a little from one side, gather it on the other, scan, then repeat. Moving too far meant reversing the process without damaging the writing surface. A long prophetic book turned reading into coordinated movement. Luke compresses this labor into the words, "He found the place." The sentence is brief, but the object makes the pause tangible and gives the listeners time to recognize the book. That recognition may have begun before a word was spoken. Isaiah 61 lies late in the book, so a complete scroll required substantial movement from its beginning. Yet copies varied, and Luke does not tell us how the manuscript had been stored. The physical starting position could shorten or lengthen the search. Some ancient biblical books circulated in more than one physical format, including complete scrolls and smaller sections. We should not assume every synagogue owned an identical library or standardized set. Possibility should not be mistaken for evidence about this room. What language filled the room is harder to determine. Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek all belonged to the region's linguistic world, and Luke does not preserve a transcript of every spoken stage. A reading might also be followed by explanation in another language. Luke writes in Greek, and his wording resembles the ancient Greek translation of Isaiah, often called the Septuagint. That observation concerns Luke's written form. It does not identify Nazareth's actual scroll. That distinction protects both the literary and historical questions. The core comes from Isaiah 61, 1-2. An anointed speaker announces good news to the poor, release, restored sight, freedom, and the Lord's favorable year. The imagery gathers social restoration, bodily release, and divine favor. Luke's line about setting the oppressed free closely echoes Isaiah 58:6. The quotation, therefore, sounds like Isaiah 61, woven with another Isaianic phrase, sharing the language of release. The shared vocabulary makes the link understandable without inventing a hidden source. Scholars explain the combination in several responsible ways. Luke may shape the quotation, inherit a Greek textual tradition, or present an interpretive reading already linking the passages. The precise point of combination remains disputed. Nothing in the evidence requires a damaged scroll, a suppressed sentence, or a censorship story. Composite quotation and textual variation are ordinary features of ancient scriptural transmission. Ancient authors frequently cited scripture with selection and adaptation. Public reading also lived beside memory. A trained reader and an attentive audience could recognize familiar wording, hear associations, and notice where an announcement stopped or shifted. The room was not hearing Isaiah for the first time. Later copies of Luke differ over a phrase about healing the brokenhearted. Textual critics compare early manuscripts to judge the older wording. The variation is evidence of copying history, not conspiracy. Responsible explanation shows the witnesses and admits the uncertainty. The scene's center is not silent decoding. It is oral performance, breath, pace, pronunciation, and a room receiving ancient words together. Luke says the fulfillment occurs in their hearing. The sound of fulfillment reaches everyone at once. That communal setting matters because each person hears alongside relatives, elders, workers, and neighbors. Interpretation becomes a public event before it becomes a private opinion. Agreement, confusion, and resistance develop in the same social space. First-century Jewish writers such as Josephus and Philo describe regular gatherings where ancestral laws were read and explained. Their accounts do not supply Nazareth's schedule, but they confirm a wider culture of public instruction. This is strong context, not a timetable. What kind of room could support that culture? Securely dated synagogues from before 70 CE often organize people around a central space rather than toward a distant stage. Architecture made face-to-face attention physically possible. Gamla, destroyed during the revolt against Rome in 67 CE, preserves a public building identified as a synagogue. Its date makes it a valuable comparison for Luke's world. Because the settlement ended violently, later rebuilding did not erase the plan. Benches line the walls at Gamla, allowing participants to see one another across the room. Columns supported the roof, while the center remained available for movement, reading, discussion, or assembly. The room encouraged interaction rather than one-directional spectatorship. This arrangement does not prove Nazareth looked identical. It does correct a familiar image, a congregation seated like a modern audience, all facing a permanent preaching platform. The evidence favors an encircling assembly, though layouts still varied. Magdala provides a second Galilean comparison. Its early Roman synagogue included a vestibule, a bench-lined reading room, columns, plaster, and traces of colorful fresco decoration. Its preservation expands the range of plausible first-century interiors. First-century gathering spaces were not necessarily bare. Magdala's red, yellow, blue, black, and white painted panels show that communal architecture could carry carefully finished surfaces. Color, however, does not justify lavish fantasy or temple-like splendor. The carved Magdala stone stood in the room. It may have functioned as a table or symbolic furnishing, but its precise use remains debated, so reconstruction should keep alternatives visible. Its imagery evokes Jerusalem's temple, but function cannot be proved. Excavators also propose that a small room at Magdala may have stored scrolls. That is plausible, not certain, and Luke itself says only that the attendant hands Jesus the Isaiah scroll. The proposal helps visualize custody while remaining clearly provisional. A responsible Nazareth image therefore borrows broad features, not a floor plan: perimeter seating, central activity, local stone, timber roofing, lamps, and a community-sized interior. The result should feel inhabited, practical, and locally built. Capernaum introduces an important caution. The monumental white limestone synagogue visible today is later than Jesus' lifetime, generally dated centuries after the Gospel setting. The common date falls in the 4th or 5th century. Its impressive columns and carved blocks can dominate modern imagination, but they should not be transferred wholesale into Luke 4, as though Jesus stood inside that surviving structure. Chronology matters more than the monument's visual appeal. Earlier remains may lie beneath the later building, yet scholars disagree about whether the exposed basalt foundation preserves a first-century synagogue. The visible white monument remains later. That uncertainty should appear in diagrams, not disappear in narration. Nazareth was no monumental city. A modest assembly hall better fits the narrative's social pressure. The reader is close enough to be known, watched, questioned, and physically confronted. Scale becomes a social fact, not merely architectural decoration. With benches around the room, Luke's phrase that every eye was fixed on Jesus becomes spatially vivid. Attention crosses the central floor from many directions. The geometry of the room intensifies the narrative's shared focus. The elder and attendant in our reconstruction represent plausible community roles, not a complete chart of synagogue offices. Exact titles, duties, and liturgical order varied and remain partly debated. They prevent the image from becoming an unsupported bureaucracy. Luke calls the person receiving the scroll an attendant, using a broad Greek term for service. The narrative emphasizes custody and handover more than rank. We should resist loading the word with later institutional details. That double transfer frames the reading. Jesus does not arrive carrying his own private copy. The community's manuscript is entrusted to him and then returned. The exchange marks both access and responsibility before witnesses. Luke explicitly distinguishes posture. Jesus stands to read and sits before speaking. This is firmer than any elaborate reconstruction built around those two movements. Those postures structure the transition from citation to interpretation for everyone. Sitting could accompany teaching in ancient Jewish settings, but Luke does not identify a special teacher's chair. He directs attention to the sudden stillness after the scroll closes. The posture is plausible. The furniture remains uncertain. Every eye remains fixed on him. The audience expects explanation, and Jesus begins with a compressed claim. The scripture has been fulfilled today in their hearing. the short statement transforms listening into the scene's central test. Luke first reports favorable speech and amazement at the gracious words. The reaction is not instant rage. It begins with approval, surprise, and the pressure of recognition. Luke allows the emotional temperature to rise in stages. Then comes the hometown question. Is this not Joseph's son? Luke lets local familiarity sit beside the extraordinary announcement without explaining every speaker's motive. Familiarity can support wonder, skepticism, entitlement, or several reactions together. The person applying Isaiah to the present is someone the town associates with an ordinary household. That social closeness makes the claim harder to keep abstract. Biography and prophecy now occupy the same small room. Jesus anticipates a proverb about healing oneself and mentions reports connected with Capernaum. Luke's narrative turns from admired words toward expectations of local privilege. The issue becomes who may claim the announced favor first. He then recalls Elijah and Elisha. Aid reaches the widow at Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, while many in Israel remain in need. Luke anchors the conflict in these scriptural examples. Both examples involve divine mercy crossing expected social boundaries. If this evidence-led journey is helping you see the scene more clearly, subscribe to World Behind the Verse. Now return to the words that shifted the room. The narrative's next step explains the change. The prophetic message is no longer only release and favor in general. Jesus places God's action beyond the audience's assumed boundaries, using stories already inside Israel's scriptures. The audience hears inclusion, not as theory, but as prophetic precedent. Luke now says the people are filled with anger. The narrator gives the emotional turn, but not a transcript of shouted objections or a detailed psychology for each person. The shared room now magnifies conflict as quickly as it magnified attention. They rise, drive him out of the town, and lead him toward the brow of the hill on which the town is built, intending to throw him down. The movement leaves interpretation behind and becomes collective force. Nazareth sits among hills, but Luke does not identify a recoverable cliff. Later traditions propose locations. The exact route and precipice cannot be established from the text. A famous tourist viewpoint cannot settle the ancient topography. A careful reconstruction resists invented curses, secret signals, or cinematic speeches. Luke's own sequence is dramatic enough. Hearing, recognition, challenge, anger, expulsion, attempted violence. Restraint keeps the violence historical rather than melodramatic or speculative. The conflict begins after a scroll is opened, but it is not caused by parchment technology. The object delivers a shared text. Interpretation brings that text into the town's present. Meaning emerges through the relation between text, reader, and hearers. Luke's key words are today and hearing. Fulfillment is announced not in solitary study, but in an audible encounter where neighbors must respond in one another's presence. The phrase turns acoustics into theology and social confrontation. By the time Jesus speaks, the Isaiah scroll is already closed and back with the attendant. The material reading has ended, yet the public meaning is only beginning. The silence after handling gives the spoken claim greater weight. Ancient literacy was uneven, but public reading allowed a text to reach people beyond those able to copy, own, or fluently navigate a manuscript themselves. Hearing extended access without erasing differences in training or status. That does not divide the room into educated readers and passive hearers. Memory, recitation, discussion, and repeated communal listening created many forms of scriptural competence. Competence could be oral, social, interpretive, and cumulative too. A synagogue gathering could therefore function as worship, instruction, deliberation, and community assembly. The balance differed by place and occasion. No single later service book defines Nazareth. The building served people before it served a single ritual template. Modern readers often meet Luke 4 by silently scanning a private, numbered page. The Nazareth audience encountered Isaiah through another person's body, breath, pacing, and selection. The medium changes the pace, authority, and vulnerability of interpretation. They could not pause the speaker, tap a footnote, or compare 5 translations. They listened from memory and evaluated the announcement together as it unfolded. The room itself became part of how meaning was tested. The scroll's slowness matters. Finding Isaiah's words required touch and time, turning the approach to the passage into a visible act before the first line was voiced. Material form shaped anticipation before content shaped reaction. Its custody matters too. The manuscript belongs within a network of preparation, copying, storage, handling, and communal trust, not simply to the person reading it. Every handoff reveals that texts depended on communities and skilled care. Archaeology narrows the visual possibilities. Bench-lined halls and central space are credible. The surviving Capernaum monument is too late. Nazareth's exact architecture remains unknown. Secure comparisons clarify while preventing false certainty about Nazareth itself. Manuscripts narrow the textual possibilities. Isaiah circulated in long columned scrolls in varied forms. Luke's Greek wording combines Isaianic language. Qumran's scroll is comparison, not provenance. Textual evidence works best when analogy and identification remain separate. Luke's scene becomes sharper when its parts stay distinct. A real object, a plausible assembly space, a carefully shaped quotation, and a hometown audience moving from attention to resistance. Together they explain the scene without replacing its unresolved edges. When you picture Nazareth now, what alters the scene most? The moving scroll, the surrounding benches, or the words heard together? Share your answer in comments and subscribe for more history behind the verse.